Alrighty, let's roll. Me popping out of chat, seeing if we can get that stuff working. I don't know if anybody's here yet, but that's fine. Fooling with the technology as always. There's my chat. That ought to work. Hi there. I'm Chris from Airwindows, and this is the Monday Q&A stream. One where I am answering questions about plugins and or other stuff. And responding to chat and such as well as needed. So what I'm going to do is shuffle the windows around until I'm not distracted by pictures of myself everywhere. And we got my lovely microphone rolling and people showing up. That's cool. I'm pleased about that. I've been having a weird time with social things in the last couple of days, to the point where I'm pretty burnt, and after doing my hour and 45 minutes of Q&A, I'm probably going to go and crash. I come bearing the new plugin vinyl dither, the update on that, and I've also made a point of, let me see, can I fool with this one? No, I really can't. I'm trying to figure out whether I can do this while not seeing my face on the screen, but I can't. So that's fine. Actually, that's not that fine. I'd really like to figure out something else. What can I do? How about pause that playback? And that's my face, but it is not a moving picture. So I'll roll with that. That means I can see the analytics information, and that's kind of what I was looking for. So there we go. And I can only assume it has not paused the actual streaming, so we're good. So yeah, right now I'm working on secret weapons. I have had a bunch of stuff that I'm getting together. Like here's something. The Rickenbacker that sits up on my wall. This now has tape-bound strings on it. I have decided that I'd prefer to use that. There's a guy that advocates for these, and I decided that he was right. Here are some things that I did to make it work. For instance, this is red yarn holding the strings on because this string likes to pop out of its slot. And this string likes to pop out of its bridge saddle. So there's a little bit of red color. What the? Okay, that was helpful. I just smashed my Rickenbacker into the ceiling fan. Bear with me, guys. Maybe I won't show you this one, okay? Let's see if it's still in tune. Still in tune. Neither of the things broke. Yeah. My world is about as stressful as I have seen it for months and months and months. It comes and goes. Recent weeks was stressful because I was ordering stuff that I needed to build my world here, and I went far too many days constantly expecting something to arrive and to have to jump up and answer the door. And since I have autism, if I do that, I spent literally every waking hour waiting for somebody to knock on the door, and that's bad for me. I can't handle it. This time it's because I have personal friends who may or may not want me killed. And I'm not making that up, but that's because of the nature of friends that I sometimes have. I maintain civilized connections with people of all kinds of different attitudes, and sometimes that's real helpful, and sometimes they just start trolling people like mad, and if I troll back, things get ugly. And some of the communities that I hang out in are getting all torn apart by, war and politics and stuff, which I am not surprised, honestly, about. A lot of what's going on at the moment, it is survival mode, folks. And I don't mean by that some kind of batshit insane QAnon nonsense. I mean, stuff is really messy, and one of Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals is don't get yourself too insane. You have to take off some time to be able to breathe and think about things and stay healthy. So that's what I mean. By that I mean that the world is in such an unstable state that it's probably not able to stay that way for very long. Things are going to break. And my job is to keep doing the stuff that I do, which often is not related to all of those things, but kind of because I support people who don't have support otherwise. And so I'll dig into building stuff and inventing and making things. But yeah, that's sometimes why it's difficult is, we live in a society, and I live in a world that does not provide a healthy environment for me to be in. So you gotta just hang in to what extent you need to, and look to whatever allies you can find. I hope that there are people who consider me to be allies, at least in sense of being able to have a place you can come where I'm bringing you cool stuff and taking a positive mental attitude, and not too much is going to go horribly wrong or terrible. So, looking at the chat, because we got the chat going on. I'm glad that you like the new shirt. This is actually a little bean pajama. But yeah, and you're going to have to wait a little bit for the music jams to come back, but I might be able to show you something interesting nevertheless, if you don't mind me getting up. The recent VHS2 release is not at all a big one. It is only Vinyl Dither coming out as its dedicated plug with the 24 16-bit and the D-Res. And I also mentioned Golem because the audio I was using to demonstrate it was a recording I made of the Rickenbacker, because before I put the tape wounds on, which I think are going to be better for what I want to do with them in future. Also, since they're tape wounds, they're like flat wounds. I don't necessarily have to change them. You can, but it also gets a worthy sound if you just leave them on there. And that's going to save some money, and it's also going to get me into a tone that's going to work well, because the trick that I'm using with the two recordings, one of them is a DI, and it could be just a straight DI. For the one that I demonstrated and that I made samples of, I'm using a VT bass. I can show you that. And the reason I shouted out Golem is because people don't necessarily remember it. But this is the VT bass. I did the sampling with the DI stuff into this, set this way, these settings on it. And that's the bass pickup going into this. And then the bridge pickup went into my guitar amp with a certain amount of overdrive, but not all that much. Turns out with the flat wounds, I gave it even less overdrive, and it also had less heavy strings. And the reason I brought up Golem is because that is a situation where I'm doing a instrument sound capture into a stereo track, one side of which is the DI and the other side of which is the amp, and then you balance them and or adjust the relative timing. And that, of course, is what Golem does. So I needed to use it just to demonstrate what I was doing. In case I need to read anything. Also, I was going to take a moment and show you something interesting. If that is, hang on. Yep, I need to add. Why can't I add the thing? I need to add that. Then power on this funky creature. That should power up. Don't mind me fooling with stuff. Oh no, it just took a while to boot. So yeah, this is one of the things that I am working on for bringing into the music jams when I do them. And I got it set up, so as you can see, there's now colors over the screen. Actually, you know something? I might as well go across the chat as well. Check this out. Here's a new thing. It's going to be a while before I can see what it's doing, but that's fine. Working on getting this going. Oh look, even more intensity. Actually, that's fairly responsive, isn't it? This is coming out of a thing called the Sleepy Circuits Hypno. And I've not got it set properly, and there's also no audio going through it, so it's not actually changing. But I'm just turning it on for the moment so that you can see what I'm doing with it. And I have a SciFX, and I can make it considerably more intense this way. And yep, so I'm looking to fool with this funky device. And I'm only just beginning to learn what the heck it even does, and the synthesizer is not running now, so I can't actually model much of it. But yeah, I got one of those to add to my music situation, and this is what it looks like when you overlay it. Now I'll make it shut up now. And power it off. So yeah, I've been busy making and doing stuff, and that is an example of one new thing. It is the too much coffee visual effect, right? At least as you were saying. So that's fun. So I got to show you that. And that combined with like battles with friends and the general madness of how the world is going. It's like I'm keeping up, but things are a little crazy. I look forward to playing with some of this stuff. I haven't turned on that rig in like months. There's too much else is going on. But I'll get back to it. I will find a way. So one of the things I was doing was that sampling session with the Rick, because I had a new set of roto sounds on it when I decided that I wanted to try the tape wounds. And it seemed to me like a terrible idea to just take those off and get rid of them without doing a good sampling session first so that I could have samples and distribute those. And the other side of that is doing the same kind of thing, but with drums. Because it's not just about like getting a bass tone that I like. My level's okay. I think I can boost the levels a little tiny bit from that. It's not just about getting a bass tone that I would want to use for stuff. Because the idea with using the guitar amp on the bridge pickup is that if you have clangy strings, you get all of this like prog rock Rickenbackery clanginess and overtones and stuff, and it fills up a lot of space that way. And you get a little distortion, all this kind of stuff. It all works out pretty good. If you're using flat wounds, that becomes, first of all, it still kind of does that because part of the brightness of the Rick is its maple body and neck. But what it also does is it gives you articulation on what you're doing rather than just chimey overtones on everything. So what you end up getting is this very focused kind of sound with a lot of clarity on stuff. Oh, David says scratchiness. I don't know why you're saying that. Maybe it's because I adjusted levels and the pot scratched a little bit. Like if my audio is out, I'm not sure how much I can do about that. It doesn't look like my audio is out. I could remove the NDI source, I suppose. I'm not sure whether it shouldn't be beating up on my computer too hard. I should still be able to do this. The other side of that is figuring out stuff to do with drums. And like I said in the announcement for the Vinyl Dither reissue, I have come up with something that is, I think, a pretty good observation, having to do with apocryphal stories of what John Bonham of Led Zeppelin was doing with his drums and why. So we're calling this Airwindows Q&A Secret Weapons. And if there's anybody here who also wants to share their secret weapon stories, that's fine. But I have stuff to share, and if there's enough of you who are interested in hearing it, I'm going to assume that you are interested in hearing it, unless I hear otherwise. This is the time to reveal the true secrets of some of that stuff. The story goes that Bonham put aluminum foil in his bass drum to make it go off like a cannon, quote unquote. I have discovered what is actually happening there and why it works. Because I have done the thing. I have put aluminum foil lining my bass drum. And I have also, hearing what it did on the bass drum, I did the same thing and put aluminum foil lining the inside of my Gretsch floor tom. So I absolutely know what's happening. It's comparable to something that I have done with the speaker cabinets and bass bins and things, like, say here. Supposing you have a speaker that is made out of a sonotube, one of these cardboard tubes, and you put the speaker in the end. If you put another speaker on the other end in phase with the first one, so that they're both compressing in or pushing out simultaneously, then it is a pressure vessel, so you can get extremely low bass out of it as long as the speakers like push and drag equally. And something that you can do, lining the inner lining, is take a little random scribbling here to make this work. You take bubble wrap, literally plastic bubble wrap, and line the inside of the tube with that, and it has sound damping qualities because plastic bubble wrap is light. It contains air inside the bubbles, but it is a sort of vinyl-y, plasticky mass and has, I want to say hysteresis. I'm looking for the technical terms here. They're not necessarily forthcoming. Like I told you, I'm under a great deal of stress. I have friends who will not actually say they're not willing to kill me for being a lefty scum. So it's stressful at the moment. Sometimes things are just going to be stressful, and that's how it goes. The guy in question is not likely to be a murderer, and if he is likely to be a murderer, it's probably not going to be me. So, and that's not the only person that I know who could either like die around about now or run amok and end up killing a bunch of people around about now. And it doesn't please me to have friends like that. So life kind of sucks at the moment. But the thing about the using plastic bubble wrap as a liner of something like a tube that is a speaker cabinet, you don't necessarily have to fill a airspace with like fiberglass or whatever to have it be acoustically damped. It's not a Reddit thing, it's like an alt-right thing, and me not purging my friends on behalf of wrong thinking and stuff, which is something that I don't really do, so you run these risks, you run these problems. When people go a little wacky, or they don't know where they stand, or they're not sure what they're doing. And it's just a thing. But as far as damping the inside of something, it's a matter of degree. Like if you took the inside of a speaker cabinet and you put pieces of paper inside it, there would be some degree of damping from those, just very little. If you put pieces of metal in there, probably not much damping, but if you have metal against a back wall, then air trying to get around the metal and into the back wall, assuming it's perfectly rigid, there's going to be a flow resistance to air flowing back in there. And for that reason, there's even damping from something as rigid as that. There's even damping from changing the size or shape of the enclosure away from just a pressure containing thing to something with internal walls. Now, where we get into the John Bonham bass drum trick is similar to this that I found, as far as you can take a cylinder and damp the cylinder by having a layer of this bubble wrap literally lining the inside of the cylinder. It is not really very powerful damping, but it does absolutely work. Now, the thing with quick answer, Jacob, you can absolutely use the trim function in the last plugin insert before the console channel plugin. That will totally work. You could also use the trim function on the console channel plugin if it has one. Some of them are so simple that they don't, and some of them do have a trim control. If it does have a trim control, it's always going to be in the correct position for the channel plugin, that you could use that as the fader and have it work. So the thing about the bubble wrap is it's not as effective damping as like solid fiberglass, but you don't necessarily want stuff to be made totally, utterly dead in there. The springiness of air has a purpose as well. And as somebody who has actually tried filling drums with fiberglass to utterly and totally damp them, only to learn that the reaction, the result was garbage. Like, you can try doing that, don't, because it's a waste of time. You wind up with just like thwap, incredibly light, non-resonant, thwappy noises. It's amusing. It's impossible to have that stuff be heard because you're killing all of the vibrations. Put this on its side and it's a bass drum. Now, what happens if you have taken a bass drum with the drum head over this part and put on the aluminum foil, and I can also explain how to do this properly. I ended up with some, another thing that I was doing in recent days was weather stripping windows in my basement, because I'm trying to make it so that the basement area has cooler air in the summer and warmer air in the winter. So I put a lot of, actually used bubble pack for that as well, because when you get stuff ordered through the mail, you wind up with large amounts of superfluous bubble pack. What I used to put layers of clear vinyl sheeting over the thermally insulated windows that I had, adding an additional layer of that, which is very useful. Putting additional plastic sheeting of any kind in front of a window will do a pretty good job of insulating it more. I was using first some 3M double-sided tape for indoor purposes, and then Frost King. Same deal. Double-sided tape used for indoor purposes. You don't have to get the full-on stuff. I can show you that. Actually, I can show you both. Hang on, let me grab this. Be right back. Yeah, I can just run over and grab some of these things. So yeah, this is a kind of not a bubble wrap. This is a kind of double-sided tape. This stuff is Scotch 3M. You can see that it's this very sticky sort of foam stuff. There's a thickness to it, and there's the red plastic outside layer. You don't need this. This is complete overkill for that purpose that we're talking about. This is for like holding stuff in your wall where you don't want it to fall off. But this is the Frost King stuff I was telling you about. It's for weather stripping. It's for putting up that plastic sheeting. What you do is you stick it around the outside edge of your window and then peel off this paper layer on the outside, which is actually quite difficult to do, at which point you have a very thin, clear double-sided tape, and you stretch the plastic layer and stick it on that. And in some cases it's heat shrinkable, so you do that and then you take a hairdryer and you stretch the additional weather stripping layer. That's all good. I've done that a lot. It helps a great deal. But you don't need a huge amount of stickiness for this or for the weather stripping stuff. You don't need this. This is much lighter duty. It's a little more removable as well if you needed to remove stuff. And this is all you would need to put on the aluminum foil in the inside of your bass drum shell. You put maybe one ring all the way around the bass drum, maybe two. You don't need more than that. And I'll note that is going to hold the aluminum foil pretty tight to the inside shape of the kick drum. It's not meant to be this loose, rattly inner lining. You'd think that maybe Like, oh, it's supposed to go off like a cannon. That's the idea. So obviously it's an additional sound source. Obviously it's meant to rattle. No, no, no. That's not what's going on here. I'm not sure whether I need to draw another picture. This is probably good enough. What's happening is you put the layer of aluminum foil on the inside of the bass drum or the floor tom or other tom, anything that you're trying to do this with. Probably even work on snare drums, but there's not much of a need for it. And press it down so that it's really kind of laminated straight to the inside of the kick drum and going all the way around. You don't want a lot of loose areas, and you don't want to make it all of little separate pieces. It's supposed to be one piece stuck onto the inside, and the fact that it's only held on by tape is important. Because if you're sticking it on, it's not going to go over the edges of the nuts and things that hold the hardware on. David is jumping ahead. Kinda. It needs to be around the inside of the kick or floor tom or whatever, pretty tight against the walls, but it's never going to be like a coat of paint. It's not even meant to be a coat of paint. There is a certain amount, like as much as a 16th or an 1/8 of an inch, probably not as much as half an inch, of airspace in there just because it won't fit perfectly. It's going to be pretty close, but it won't fit perfectly. And then you put your heads on and tune it up much the same as before. And now what you've got is a situation where playing the drum, kicking on the kick drum, or indeed, if it's a floor tom, hitting the top of the floor tom with the stick and the drum head that goes there, is deforming the position of the aluminum foil violently. The amount of air pressure you put into that, if you play good and loud, and of course John Bonham, as you know, plays really loud, is modulating the position of the aluminum foil even though it's literally taped firmly to the inside of the thing. And you know what that does? David Pixley was ahead of the curve here. It's a damping thing. It changes the decay. It's not that it makes things rattlier or crispier or whatever. It changes the decay in a really interesting way. Yep, swoosh, David nailed it. This is why we love you. Sometimes you're way ahead of the curve and you see these things. So if you've got a kick drum decay, and the amplitude goes like that, there's going to be a certain amount of rattle. There's going to be a certain amount of manipulating it. But what's really happening with the behavior of the special decay that you get from loosely taping, and it's not that loose, but it's not that tight either. You don't want it to be literally a coat of paint, like plate the inside of the kick drum with aluminum. That'll just change the resonance of the shell. That doesn't have the effect we're talking about. It's going to change it like this. Your decay, it's going to make a little more noise briefly because there's like a discontinuity. Aluminum is relatively rigid. In order for it to dissipate energy, you have to move it. And in moving the aluminum, be nice, David. In moving the aluminum, it's physically changing its shape. And in changing its shape, there are losses because it's not perfectly springy. This is not like a spring in there. Aluminum is a fairly dead substance. If you laminate it to stuff, it's pretty good for damping. Like if you take aluminum tape like one uses for heating ducts. Here, I'll show you some of that too. Just a moment. Jumping up and... I love that I get to jump up and get things. This new microphone kicks butt. I can get all manner of stuff from around my place. So here is aluminum tape. It is from a place called Intertape, made in the USA. They're very proud of themselves. And this is like duct sealing tape. And this is just the kind of stuff, if you put a strip of this onto, for instance, a cymbal, that cymbal will become insanely dead right away. It's really very effective at being laminated on a surface. In fact, I have put this on the inside of speaker cabinets just for that reason, to make the reverberations inside the speaker cabinet, the reverberations inside the wood, the panel resonances, cut down, because there's a certain amount of mass loading. But also, if you stretch and compress this by putting it on a vibrating surface and sticking it to it with its adhesive, it is going to resist being stretched and compressed. There is a physical behavior having to do with the soft aluminum where it absorbs energy, turns it into heat. That's how damping works. So when you have the loose aluminum foil, and not terribly loose, but just taped on with a couple of strips all the way around, and then the aluminum foil all the way around, single panel, because if it's a single panel, you are compelling it to deform when you hit it with a loud noise, like hitting the head with a stick or a kick drum beater or something. What you get is, again, this threshold of discontinuity. If you just tap the drum head, noises around here in the decay tail, that's not enough to move the aluminum. It's taped securely on, remember. So the discontinuity is way up at the top of this, where you've kicked the kick drum or hit the tom-tom really hard, and it is absolutely deflecting. Sometimes you can even see it. You see the aluminum kind of buckle for a second. And the point where it is still moving, the point where it is still deflecting, is where it is sucking energy out of the drum decay. Beyond that point, it's not doing anything. Below that point, it's not doing anything. So we have a discontinuity that is not just like stuffing it full of pillows. Instead, you've got this damping that's happening at a particular level and can also furnish its own sound, like a certain rattle to it. And you're also making a rigid metal internal surface, so it's kind of brightening stuff up in its own special way. So the end result of working with this stuff, the end result of lining your kick drum, lining your tom-tom with aluminum foil that is taped on with this continuous ring of like this stuff, this Frost King or whatever weather stripping tape that you might want to use, is you then have a undamped drum that acts like a bunch of those Led Zeppelin drums that you know and love. It lets you do no damping at all. You wind up with, the completely undamped drum, rather than being like clong, clong, blong. It's like thwap, 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 thwap. It's much more aggressive, and you get a big, like edgy punch and hit from having no damping in there. And then that damping resistance of modulating the aluminum foil. And you could probably, the aluminum foil does not seem to have a tune to it, no. In fact, what ended up happening is I did the floor tom, and the floor tom became incredibly low sustain. I still have it tuned to a really low note, but man, it just goes the heck away. It's like and then it's just gone. The thickness is just your ordinary, not, I think it might be heavy duty. It's certainly like Reynolds wrap or something. So it's fairly heavy, but it's not like ultra heavy. It's enough where it holds its shape. It's not like tinsel, in other words. But it doesn't have to be so heavy that it's like, wow, it's hard to bend. I could actually, I'll run off and get some of that. Here, check it out. Be right back. Gotta love doing stuff where I can run off and get stuff to demonstrate. Turns out it was literally called heavy duty, but there's stuff that's heavier than this. This is what I used. It's just straight up Reynolds wrap. It's straight up aluminum foil. I didn't have to get it any wider. What I had is fine. And this is as heavy as it is. It's not super crazy heavy, but it is not all that light. Oh, I had good coffee this morning, but I didn't have an unusual amount. I don't always get to talk about these secret weapons and things, and this is kind of fun. And also, it's like my energy is going towards that because, like I said, there's some other things that are going real crappy at the moment, and so I'm like reconnecting towards the things that I care about, which is always good advice. If you're able to do that in a situation of crisis and difficulty, it's nice to be able to do. So yeah, I use this. It's like bog standard. I think they probably call everything heavy duty. But it's, as far as I'm concerned, this is ordinary, boring, regular kind. I do not yet have a audio example pre and post. What I have is a whole pile of changes all at the same time. So again, when I'm able to do more rock and roll style stuff, that is going to contribute to it. And I've changed the kind of bass strings that I'm using. I'm changing, again, I'm running the bass DI part through this, and I'm going to continue to keep that because it worked out really well. And the previous recording that I made was the drum kit without the aluminum foil, but also with all of the mics being SM57s. I've been able to get some Roswell mics for that, not Colaris's for it, but the mini K47s are very desirable, and I was able to replace the SM57s with that. So everything is basically changing all at once. And it's a lot of work doing it, but it's worth doing. So I will not have a audio example pre and post. You're going to have to assume that as a drummer, I know what the sound of my drums are like, both when I'm wearing headphones and in the open room. I think it was most striking with the floor tom, honestly. Like the bass drum is one thing, but the floor tom really complete sea change. It totally reshaped itself. And honestly, I feel like a good example of what this stuff sounds like, I swear that on a bunch of that early Led Zeppelin stuff, it sounds like he was still doing this. And I will note that it's easy enough to tell that he's not using aluminum foil when he is going to the Vistalite drums, because they are clear. You can see through them. So the thing is that Vistalite drums, being acrylic drums, also have damping to them. They are also not as resonant as wooden drums and wooden drum hoops and all that kind of stuff. So, like, think about Bonham on Vistalites, or think about Billy Cobham with the Mahavishnu Orchestra on Vistalite drums. Very similar thing. Like, you could accomplish the same stuff just by going to Vistalites. And it is not the same thing. It's like, let's go back to this picture. the click is here. Now, having stuff be a little tiny bit more reflective, or having stuff that can crackle slightly when you compress it, to the extent that that's even happening, that's a little bit more energy. It really does not wind up being that big of a change in terms of the attack. Maybe it brightens the click transient a little bit, but really what it's doing is it's damping this super loud stuff real aggressively, and then it just kind of stops. Like, there is a striking shortening of the decay, and it also kind of coarsens the decay. It's like if you put a ring modulator on it, or if you were FM modulating the sound of a kick drum. Another thing that I got to get into is when I get back into the music thing and start doing the synthesizers, I've gotten back into doing the DFAM for the kick drum, because like I have it and can use it, but also rather than doing the purer kick drums that I was doing, the DFAM is just set up from the word go to do a FM synthesis. It's two different notes that can go down in pitch, or they can go up in pitch, or whatever. You can do crazy things with them. You can include noise, but it's set up to be able to frequency modulate one by the other in a very convenient, controllable way, so you can get a more organic sound out of that, and I'm probably going to lean into that. Well, that's not so dissimilar to doing this, lining the bass drum with aluminum foil, because the energy that you're taking out, or the energy that you're introducing by having the additional resonating element, the additional thing going on, that's not going to be a neat, clean, continuous tone. So it will mangle the sound. It'll mangle the resonance in interesting ways, and that's also part of how that sound comes to be. Like if you get into, on Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, I'm assuming that pretty much everybody has heard that, even to the point where you might remember a particular drum fill. And by that I mean when Stairway to Heaven has been going and going and going, and you got the guitar solo, and it's getting to the end bit, and there's that part where John Bonham goes, and it's really loud, but you'll notice that although it's very loud, it is not sustaining along to smear through and get in the way of everything else. Those toms hit super loud, they hit super hard, they're very clearly, physically, obviously there, but then they're gone. And this is not about damping them with putting lots of padding or putting pillows in them or something like that. Bonham would freak out if you tried to put pillows in his bass drums. I do not put pillows in my bass drums. Well, maybe he didn't put pillows in his bass drums, but he had damping as well. It's just not what he thought it was. He was like, oh, this makes them go off like cannons. And it's like, nope, you just have an alternative form of damping that's really effective. You can be doing stuff like that and not know exactly why it works. What he's doing is making the drums quieter by doing that. Not louder. It's not like it makes it rattle louder or something or go kaboom. He's making the drums quieter by making the decay different. Again, the picture there is it sustains louder to a point because there's more to rattle and bounce around in there, and it's being manipulated and changed. And then it rapidly turns to dying away faster. And then below a certain point, it's not messing with the tone of things at all anymore. Oh, the diaper thing is actually a Tony Levin on a Peter Gabriel album. He was doing a bass track where they needed to damp it down, and he had a clean, thank goodness, he had some form of diaper that was unused and put it under the strings of his bass in order to give the required sound. Yeah, you're correct, Bo, that he would sometimes put felt strips on the batter head. I'm not sure that that's always the case, but there were some times when he would do that, but he did not go for pillows inside the bass drum. It's quite the opposite. And so by, not that I'm doing my own thing. I want to get a similar thing, but I also want to benefit from some of this stuff that I'm able to analyze and figure out and put into action. Because there's a lot to be gained from figuring out what's really going on with some of these things. Iorana, the aluminum trick would absolutely work in a bass drum and tom without a resonant skin. Now, the tom that I'm using actually has a resonant head on the bottom, and the kick drum that I'm using actually has a resonant head on the front, although there's a hole cut in it. I've got a slightly tightened up resonant head with a sort of medium-sized hole in the center, because I just felt like doing it that way. There's an additional resonance there, and there's more to the sound that way. But you could just have the aluminum foil around the inside of it and only the batter head and still get away with that pretty good. That said, if you do have the resonant head, it's a really beautiful way to make the resonant head not hang around as long, because again, it changes the attack, including of the resonant head. As long as it's resonating hard enough to sympathetically vibrate and move the aluminum foil that's near it, that aluminum foil will suck energy out of it. So what happens is you kick it really hard, all of the stuff goes on, including the aluminum vibrating to the point where it doesn't anymore, and then the decay continues. And it's really effective. It's really effective at pulling energy out of the drum without simply making it super damped and quiet. Basically, because the internal space of the drum is still open air, you get a sort of microacoustic of extremely again, Bonham sound is a really good example of all of this. So many of those drum tracks that we know about, like I mentioned the tom-tom fills on Stairway to Heaven, but we can also go all the way to the back, or to the beginning of I keep thinking Communication Breakdown, but that's not the one. Good Times, Bad Times. The thumps in there have a particular shape, like it's open. That's the sound of, granted, a drum with a complete resonant head on the front, but it is the sound of a open drum without the felt strips, without the resonant damping, without a pillow inside it. But that's still dying away way faster than it otherwise would. And especially as you went to larger drum sizes, this becomes really relevant. Like, you need to have a kick drum sound where, because of the reverberating inside of the drum, your kick attack, it's not just a click, it's a click within a tiny box, and it echoes. And it echoes in a form where it makes the drum sound, because the drum sound is the sound of that box with the heads on it. But if you just have it completely undamped, you're getting into more like Simon Phillips with The Who or whatever. Simon Phillips is a drummer who was noted for taking over from Keith Moon when Keith Moon died. And Mooney is also another guy who, he wasn't lining his stuff, so he produced a undamped drum sound that was a lot sustainier than Bonham. Bonham was doing this thing where, he thought of it as making things more explosive, but what he was really doing was damping the drums by doing that. And I'm not sure exactly when or exactly how long he was doing it, but having done this myself, I now know what that sounds like, and I feel like I've heard it a million times before in so many Led Zeppelin tracks. All the times where it's kind of cardboardy and kind of rattly and just loads of impact and very dense and thick and solid. But then it's also like, it doesn't go boom. It's just flap and then gone. These are the things. And Jacob has a very good point of playing with the pitch relations between batter head and resonant head is really useful. Now, throwing cotton balls, or indeed like crumpled up paper, or some people have used crumpled up newspapers. Like I believe that Max Weinberg of the E Street Band was a guy who needed a particular kind of paper towel or something. It's all a matter of if you're going to be wailing on drums good and hard, you're basically driving the drum. Like, there's a reason why I made this attack rounded rather than just being a point. Like, if you have a quiet attack, I'll draw this over here a little bit. You can have the quiet attack be the neat little point. But if you're doing a really hard attack, it's going to act kind of like... You can hit so hard that you choke the drum. It's not able to make noise louder than a certain amount, so you're just overpowering it. And that is a rock technique that's used by a lot of people. Anytime you're really beating the living crap out of the drum and you've learned like the correct... You hit and then pull back off again, going for extreme velocity rather than just force and weight. You don't push into the drum. You're basically like doing a whip crack on it and pulling the stick back off the drum. And when you can play loud like that, which I've done all my life because I've always played drums loud, you're able to force the drum into this zone where it can't actually keep up, so it starts to choke. And some people who don't play rock music would be like, oh, stop hitting the drums so hard. You're basically just bashing it to death and you don't get the tone. And you're like, yeah, I know. I'm not trying to get the tone. I'm trying to get this effect. Because when you choke the drum, it's sustaining its loud section beyond just the initial impact. And so that's going to mix better and it's going to make the sound that you're looking for. And that's why I've got this picture here with the rounded off tip. Basically with this damping, you're hitting so hard that you're choking the drum and there's a limit to how loud it can get. And then as it starts to activate the aluminum foil inside the shell, it's damping to a certain point, so it's also cutting back after it's sustained a little bit this way. So it's this continuous arc of a attack. And this is also, like in terms of modular synthesis, one device that I've been very fascinated with, although I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get one, but it got my attention big time, is a device by the Rabbit Elephant company. Rabbit Elephant does really expensive Eurorack modules in very small quantities, and so they're kind of unobtainium. You basically can't get them. But if I had one, it would be right there. And the idea with the Rabbit Elephant stuff is they're going... And we might end up doing things like this when I start working with VCV Rack, which is not right away, but I will get into it. I will get into VCV Rack at some point. Much like I showed you the visual effects there, I'll also start doing sessions on VCV. Very often, when people are doing attacks and things on, say, a kick drum, what they'll do is go, oh, hey, here's a way to do an attack. Boop. There's my attack and decay. See, my kick drum goes like this. This is the amplitude of it, and it goes boom. And maybe the pitch drops, or maybe not. And these sound really weak as far as professional grade dance music or rock music or anything like that drums, because that's not how it works. Or you can do an exponential one, which is what I've drawn here. And that's also easy to make and not what you necessarily want. Because when you've got this as a amplitude attack, it's actually better for a frequency range. But if this is your amplitude, the sound is gone before you can have any low frequencies in here. So what folks like Rabbit Elephant are doing when they're designing a hardware device that will produce kick drums, and Jacob again nailed it, the transient peak that you make through overhitting a drum that then chokes and then dies away. If you tune it low, it's easier to make that happen. You tune really high and it's easier to have a nice smooth fall away, which isn't necessarily what you want. Tune low and it's way easier to make this spike happen, which is often what I like. It just doesn't record very well all the time. I've always liked low-tuned drums, except for not always the snare. Sometimes I like the snare to be high, but I've always liked kicks and toms to be low-tuned enough that you can get that spike in there. But what Rabbit Elephant are doing is going, okay, we want to do a volume and frequency envelope, but it's not necessarily going to be the same thing. Not only that, maybe we want our volume envelope to look like this. Maybe we want attack, a certain amount of sustain, and then a faster release, or a pitch envelope that is a very fast fall away and then a slower decay. They're thinking of things in terms of composite envelopes, and that has a lot to do with how to make good sounding drum sounds. Because it is all about, and that also depends, David, because the thing about it is Max Weinberg spent years with the E Street Band getting an amazing sort of rock soul review sound out of burying his sticks and kick drum beater in the heads, which damaged him physically and gave him tendinitis and gave him lots of problems, and he eventually learned not to do it. But while he was doing it, that was a unique sound. So he wasn't drawing out the sound, he was crushing in the sound. And this is something that you can do, although it's not good for you. And this is also something that you could model in terms of making your amplitude and pitch envelopes follow that stuff. Which is why I do things like even now, with the D-fan, the way that I've got it set up, I've taken a capacitor and patched it through. And what that's doing is, let's see. I've got a spare envelope, like from over here, and I have patched that through a capacitor into a VCA that's also present on the DFAM. It's like an additional VCA or a VCA additional modulation. And I've also got a small capacitor to ground. And this is just part of this little wiring harness from patching this output to this input. Taking an additional VCA, which could be anything, could be like, say I've got it going really slow. It's going boom. But if I patch it through a capacitor, that is forcing it to be a quicker envelope. Patching the output of the one VCA through the capacitor, and this would work in VRAC too. I'm likely to spend some time fooling with this kind of stuff when we start doing that. Means I'm shortening the burst of additional volume that's being added rather than just having it be the same thing. And when I patch in the additional capacitor, and this is purely in analog, but there's ways of doing it in VCV. I am making a slowing of the attack. So rather than initially hitting with exactly the same speed as the other attack, if I put the capacitor to ground here, it's not letting the energy instantly hit, and then it's rounding off any small details that might be happening, any small edges, because it's a low-pass filter that way. But I'm putting it on an envelope, so what it's doing is slowing the speed of this attack, and that is slowing the amplitude of the VCA, so that if I've got the pitch envelope going from a very high frequency, the loudest sound is not going to be the top of that high frequency. Instead, it's going to ramp up very, very quickly. And it's going to reinforce the mid-range more than just only the highs. And these are all things that you do if you're getting into the sound design of it all. And things that we're going to be doing when I get into VCV Rack and get that rolling. Probably have to be using headphones for that. And it's another thing more doing my work. And I'm not sure exactly how hot it's going to get in here when I have all this stuff running. But these are the headphones I've been using for when I have Logic up and I'm doing stuff with that. It's probably also what I'm going to use for VCV. So I don't get to jump up and show you where tinfoil is. But I've moved it so that I have a jack right there. So there's a little more stretch to this rather short cable, just so that I can work a little more comfortably with stuff like that. I had to make a little cable extension because otherwise this would have to plug into a thing behind the camera over there, and it's like dangling just from right here over to where it's a good way of breaking the cable. So yeah, this being the Secret Weapons chat, that's basically what I came with today, is the work that I was doing on my drums, and also explaining a little bit about what I was doing with that Rickenbacker. You heard a little bit of that on the video for the reissue of Vinyl Dither. People are asking also like, oh, is this the best dither? I'm like, no, it's a previous dither that I had. It's just one that you can try. Is this the best for doing bit crushing? Well, actually, no, it sucks for bit crushing because it doesn't sound like bit crushing. It sounds like just the regular signal, except for that now there's noise. So, you take your chances, I guess. It was also kind of fun when I was doing that video to say like, okay, guys, this is what you get for me doing this work backed by Patreon. And I had put all of the old plugins, I had taken them out in order to do the starter kit so that people could see how much was in the starter kit list. And then I just put everything back, opened up the menu, and started scrolling through the entire Airwindows collection. And that was fun. That's like, yeah, you get something from all of this. And there's more coming, but, it does get a little overwhelming after a while, so take your chances. That's another reason why I get into doing stuff like setting up drums and so on. I'm actually thinking of, I had a situation where I had built, pretend there's a wall behind the cylinder here. I had taken a couple of microphones and literally embedded them in the wall behind and over my drum kit, only to have one of them break. So they were my attempt at doing a really interesting sort of overheads, but overheads that were also PZMs. And one of the things that happened with that is when you have a microphone built into your wall, it gets a lot of lows and it gets a lot of mid-ranges. And it gets an extremely high output, and it's just really overwhelming there. But I do still have a couple of, David, you're just messing with me now. U-laws. That's how I can tell you're full of crap, is that you start talking about U-law. So I have still got 2 cheap condenser microphones embedded in my wall where my drums are. So I'm thinking about maybe testing them out and seeing if one of those survives and one of them is broken. Because I remember one of them was broken. It just became a lot of nasty hiss and crackly noise and was no good. I think because moisture got into the thing, because it was embedded in the wall and I hadn't thought it out well enough. But if one of them survives, I might use it as an additional sort of extra mic just built in there somewhere, because I'm setting up the drum recording system. I'll draw another picture. This is a drawing picture day. Prog rock drum kit. Kick drum, snare, stool for sitting on, and insane number of toms. This is the floor tom that has aluminum foil in it, and a couple of cymbals, and there's a hi-hat over here as well, all that kind of stuff. So what I'm doing regarding miking this, and this is something that I'm developing, hopefully it's going to work. I'll see whether I get much mileage out of it, because it's doing, I'm trying to see whether I can get something that I want out of here, is crude representation here. Left and right become front and to the side at about waist height. They're sort of side on to all of the toms and things to some extent. They're certainly side on to the snare. The snare is basically side mic'd from every single microphone this way. And they're centered in such a way where the snare is more, this is not really rendered very well, but the snare is more or less centered from where the mics live, and you've got left and right here, and then your middle track here has to be phase flipped because it is behind the drum kit rather than in front of it. Rather than being, your kick drum mic inside the kick drum doing a spotlit thing, instead I'm doing one that's like behind and under the drummer at like floor level, and pointing straight at the kick drum, and also side on to the snare drum. So that gets put in the center, and the way that it combines with these seems to work out pretty good, except for that my previous attempt at doing this, which you can hear on the track Confined that I've been using for everything, is entirely with SM57s. So I'm going to try doing it with condenser mics, and I have high hopes for this in the sense of it will get a sound that I'm looking for. It'll get that sort of late 60s, early 70s, extremely live, extremely punchy, using all of the, physical, mechanical tricks that we use for doing this kind of stuff. Oh, and one more thing. Seeing as I'm talking about stuff that I'm doing, these black things are literally doors. They're gobos. They're large plank-like objects, wooden room dividers that go up as tall as a door would go up and sit on the floor, and they are reflectors. So they are enclosing the drums, but they're not wrapping around the drums. Instead, they're kind of wrapping the other direction a little bit. And then there's a little additional room space in here. So that is the trick that was used on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band Reprise, where you have a drum set, and then he wanted the sound to be smaller rather than a huge giant-ass room. So he put up gobos right around the Beatles in the middle of Abbey Road Studio A and got this very tight, aggressive sound, because immediate reflections off of these drums will also bounce off of the gobos, or the doors, or whatever. I'm using doors for it, and also get into the microphones, but then bounce further and be gone. Same deal as with the drums, of getting it so that your immediate acoustic environment is full of stuff and there's a bunch of sound right there where you're making the sound, but then the sustain, the die away, is going away a lot faster. So this putting gobos in the immediate vicinity of the drums is very handy. And doctoring things so that they don't just sustain away. You don't necessarily want this shape. This is the natural shape of sound dying away in air when nothing is messing with it. And you want to manipulate that shape both to fill in the loudest part so that it fills more space. Like echoes will do that very effectively. I will draw some like this. Supposing you have a bunch of really tight little cluster echoes right away. Immediately what that's done is it's taking the loudest part of your attack and blurring it out by repeating it, and then dies away. So you've just widened your attack by that alone, because you had some near reflections. Mind you, if you had the near reflections and then they continue to sustain so much, you'd wind up with slow decay again. The idea is to have a couple of near reflections that are producing about as much volume, about as much loudness as you would have from the raw sound, and then you let the sound bounce away and dissipate somewhere. You don't make it a tight little enclosed box that will sustain and ring like a bell. You gotta do those brief little echoes that are not gonna sit around constantly. They don't sustain forever. Instead, you make them so that your decay looks more like this. There's the couple of things that are spreading out that initial attack, because without it, everything is too pointy. But then the sound dies away and isn't in the way nearly as much. And that's something that can be done in electronics. That's something that could be done in VCV rack. It's a general concept. It's like one of your fundamentals rather than specific details relative to the specific thing that you're doing. You think in terms of amplitude envelopes. You think in terms of the shapes of the sound that you're making and how pointy they are, whether you can distribute them, whether you can reshape them, where you get to take energy out. Same deal with gated reverbs. There's been some people who have been really happy with bright ambience, which is very useful for that because it is essentially a super short gated reverb. Used in its full capacity. Where's my pictures? Bright ambience does this with your attack. You get the little pointy attack there, and then bright ambience just literally echoes it super densely until it's done, and then absolutely stops. So you can manipulate the shapes of a lot of things that way. And that is how we get different kinds of attacks. That's how we manipulate stuff into useful shapes, into useful forms. Because the purest attack of do I even have a good drawing of that? No, but I do have a blank page. The purest exponential decay thing of your perfectly nice resonant, high-tuned drum that you hit but not so hard that it chokes and then it dies away. That's one form of things, but that's really far from what people get excited about when they're like, wow, that's a slamming drum kit. Oh my God, that's a really powerful beat. Usually what that means is not only is stuff hitting harder and blurring out enough that there is a sustained racket very briefly, but then it's dying away faster than just the pure exponential decay. When you do the 1970s, like the mid-70s studio thing of just overdamped drums where they just die away real fast, where that goes wrong is it's not really spreading out the initial decay in the way that like a John Bonham kick drum or Keith Moon's drum sounds did. It's not really doing the sustaining the attack and spreading it out a little bit with acoustic properties and the way that the drum resonates. So yeah, there's a lot going on with that. I see, Bo, you would like to have pictures of my drum room. At some point I will do that. I will let you see that kind of stuff. You can see pictures of me playing drums if it comes to it. I'll just move a camera up there and do that. I've missed a bunch of chat. Let me have a glance at what's going on here. I don't know what I can do as far as custom envelope curves as a plugin. I've done a number of different envelope manipulating things. They just don't necessarily do this. Drum sounds, yeah, can be very difficult. That's one of the things I've been working on. Yeah, and of course, Jake, when you say that going aggressive on attack times, clipping also does useful things as well. Like one of the ways, I talked about this in an Evergreens, one of the ways that the Rolling Stones Let It Bleed got its sounds was it was working on a old, I think Helios, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm mistaken. I've got it written down somewhere. They were running on an old sort of EMI or something console that distorted really easily. So there's a lot of stuff going on in there where they had percussion sounds that, like, where's my picture? Constantly referring back to interesting and useful pictures. Like with this. If you take this drum sound where it is being hit so hard that the drum chokes. So you have the spike and then you have the sustain of it. And then you distort the spike. You have a pretty usable sound out of the result. You basically are distorting it just right where the spike has gotten crunched away, but the chokedness of the drum is not itself distorting. And that has all kinds of uses. You can use forms of distortion, especially forms of hard clipping. I think clip only is a beautiful example of stuff that can be used that way, although you might have to gain stage it in interesting ways. These are all ways of manipulating the sound. These are all ways of manipulating the way that attacks hit, because attacks are really significant. Like you can use low-pass filters, transient smoothers, and things like that, stuff like acceleration or whatever, to step on overly spiky attacks and kind of stop them being able to do anything. And that can combine with the rest of the sound in a useful way. And yeah, the ultra-high perceived tickiness, this is one of the things that analog gear naturally smoothed out. So when we have digital gear that leaves it in, it can become really obnoxious, especially if your gear is so perfect that it leaves in all of the high frequency ticks that you don't want. And everything is like poking you in your eyeballs and obnoxiously percussive. There's a number of approaches to dealing with that. Yeah, Foco was talking about overtones on a percussive body sound and a convincing way to meld that with noise texture. Well, the thing about that, here's something I'm sure I can see that this is going to be a fertile ground for doing stuff when I start doing the VCV. That's totally a plan of mine, because I'd be able to demonstrate it in a way that people can actually do, and that'll be handy. But one of the ways to melt body sound is modulating it in interesting ways. And there's any number of ways of doing that. Like, you can compress a simple note that's not doing stuff properly for you, but then if you're also frequency modulating it so that it wiggles and wavers, you can quickly get into a more organic texture that is exactly useful. So yeah, the compression and distortion don't mess with the fundamental tones of something like your 909 kicks or whatever nearly as effectively as frequency modulating. Again, DFAM. Those people who like DFAMs and use them for kick drums know what they're talking about. I did that for a while, and then I started doing a bunch of different variations, and am sort of leaning back on that again for no better reason than it's able to do that stuff. It's able to do not only a pitch envelope that goes do, but that you can also overlay another weird pitch envelope that does other weird things, or is going the opposite direction, or whatever. And when you frequency modulate the one with the other, you get a really weird, complicated organic sound. And when you're working with actual drums, and this is something that I've been doing for years, you can take the drum and tune it so that it's like, and this is perfectly in tune, all of the resonances resonate the right way, and you get the drum head, the drum skin kind of sound. But then if you take one or two of the lugs on the side and start loosening those and screwing it all up, you wind up getting into this weird, distorted, ugly zone where it's kind of going whack. And if you tune that just right, you get a really complicated pile of like low frequency overtones and interference effects. And then when you mic that, you wind up with a really dense, solid, bassy whoomph that dies away fairly quickly, because when you do that, you start losing sustain. And that's part of how a lot of classic drum sounds work, is dissonance and filling up space. Like if you're talking about melding the body of the drum, like the note, right? Especially if you're talking about 909s or whatever, you've got the note. It's an oscillator, it makes a note. And then you're trying to modulate it with noise, but noise is too many frequencies at once. Whether it be low frequency or whatever, that's all the frequencies at once. So, oh no, don't be sorry, that's a very good idea. If you put a flanger, for instance, on your note and then just cranked it up to a really high frequency of vibrato, that immediately gives you a dense, complicated pile of overtones and undertones that are going to be more effective as far as your low frequencies that are giving you your drum sound. So, don't be sorry at all. That's a really good observation for this bit of the conversation. And yeah, as far as capturing overtones in the body of your drum or whatever, and then manipulating it, the thing about it is you can do things like narrow Q cuts, as Jacob is suggesting. Transient designers can affect the tick of things, messing with stuff with the release time. But often what you're doing is just kind of garbaging up the dense, bassy, resonant qualities of things to the point where you get your, like Joku says, the Boards of Canada drum sound, flub, bub. And it's all part of the sound design of things. And there are many ways of doing it all. But what I find interesting, and this is why I lit up so much as far as, oh, see you later, Bo. This is why I lit up so much as far as doing the John Bonham aluminum foil experiment. See, you need these things. You need this, and you need regular old tin foil. Is that it is a analog acoustic method of doing really relevant stuff to manipulate the actual sound that's being produced before the mics even get it. Because if you're making an acoustic sound in a room, that's also going to be affected by like the room tone, the immediate reflections off of the walls, off the floor, and those are very predictable. There's going to be a certain amount of die away in terms of high frequencies from sound going through air, and the walls are going to lend their own color to it because they are not perfect reflectors. They're not like concrete. Concrete is pretty close to a perfect reflector, but it sounds extremely ugly. So the walls and things will color stuff, will let through some things and reflect others. In particular, walls that are not super sturdy like concrete are not going to contain super low bass very well. So the super low bass will tend to go right through and not bounce back. And that's going to help the recording to the extent that having too much super lows bouncing back and all tied up is going to make things messy. Although there is a corollary there to like some very famous techno clubs, like Tresor in Berlin immediately comes to mind. Tresor is a beautiful story, and I feel like I understand it very well in the context of this, because the idea is it was a unbearably loud German techno club that really defined the genre that they built with this very atonal, aggressive techno music. And part of the reason that it does the way that it do is because Tresor was a bank vault. That's a concrete room. That's a stone cube, a cube of air surrounded by stone. So basically, this extremely influential German techno club was an acoustic space where the low frequencies could not get away and just kept reverberating around. Anything that they played down there would just explode and turn into a wall of sound. And not just a wall of high frequency sound. Everything rattled around and broke your ribcage. And it was quite an experience. So one of the key tricks of your ultimate underground techno club for like house and techno music, where you've got a bunch of aggressive noises and also bass, kick drums that just beat you up, is to be in an environment where that noise can't get away. It sustains and it builds up and it just gives you a pounding. That's part of the trick to that, is having it enclosed in such a space. And that's not the same recipe for doing good drum recording in like rock or whatever. If you're doing drum recording in rock and your stuff just built up in that way, it would be just a pile of rumble and you wouldn't have enough impact. It wouldn't really convey the right result. In rock, basically what you're doing is much like with the kick drum sculpting that we're talking about. You cut back some of the resonance so that there's a dense pile of smack and then just dies away fairly quickly so that you can have a repeated sound, loud, soft, loud, soft, loud, soft, rather than a sustaining rumble that has no rhythmic elements to it. So yeah. Arana is talking about being in a traditional Japanese house with a lot of paper and wood and clay and sand and a bit of glass. Yeah, that's going to have very interesting acoustics too. That's probably acoustics that will reinforce certainly more delicate acoustic music is going to be well served by that, because it's enclosed enough where it's quiet. Room dividers and things will be just solid enough to have some acoustic purpose, but it's going to be an open and enclosed space in a larger sense. Like where I'm working, namely here, this is a ground floor room, which is supposed to be a living room, but there is a big old doorway towards a hallway that goes upstairs and also into the kitchen. And then there's another big old entryway into what's supposed to be a dining room, except for that I have drapes and guitars hanging where that sits. So I never try to walk through there because it would be impossible. But sound can get right out of here into adjacent rooms and bounce around there. Where I'm at, sound gets to get right out of this room, but I also have mirrors on the back wall, partly just to make it feel as if it's a larger room, but they also reflect highs briefly before all of the sound goes through the large open areas and go away. So acoustics of the room that you're working in is always very important. There's a lot going on with all of that. And this is one of the reasons why I tend to denigrate relying upon headphones for stuff. I should also point out, using my large pile of notes, which note was it that showed me this? Let's refer to this note. If you are listening through headphones, because the spike that I've drawn a line for, you can clip this off, right? If you have this sound, and it's a spike, and then it chokes, and then this is the output of the rest of the sound. If you're listening on speakers, this spike is going to reflect off of your desk. It's going to reflect off of adjacent surfaces. It's going to bounce around a little bit and spread itself. If you're listening over headphones, that spike can get right by you because it's right against your ears and then it's gone. It's so brief that you don't really register it. There's like just something bright there and then you don't really perceive what it's about. And this is why in my monitoring plugin, I have the peaks only, because the peaks only is doing something where it's using all passes to stretch out this spike unnaturally to where it can be more clearly heard. It's doing like this with it, stretch. And something like bright ambience would also work for that, just in a not as useful way. Brief sounds do not get perceived with headphones nearly as easily, so they're extremely deceptive. You can be much more aware of reverb levels and things on headphones because the peak energy gets by you real easily, although it can also do hearing damage if you have it at too high of an amplitude. Like if you want to wreck your hearing for good, you don't necessarily want to go for only brief peaks. You want to do something where you're in an environment that you're being hit by a sustained and overwhelming blast, kind of like this. There's a story, I forget who was telling it, but there apparently was a guy who got permanent hearing damage from one event, and it wasn't a rock concert or something like that. No, he was in the bathroom trying to work on his toilet. And he lifted the top of the tank up and was going to do something and got startled and dropped the top of the tank back onto the tank of the toilet, all of these being ceramic objects. Dropped it from a height of about 4 to 6 inches, and they didn't break. And while they didn't break, he was in a enclosed space that was producing high-frequency sounds at like 200 dB or so. And because the toilet tank lid landed on the toilet tank, and then rattled around a bit while it landed. That's like a tambourine, but of incredibly rigid ceramic objects vibrating. So the poor bugger killed himself with like 300 dB and a painful amount of loud and permanent hearing damage from one instant. And that's partly because it's sustained rather than being a single spike. No, don't drop your toilet tank lid from a height of 6 inches. Like, be careful if you're moving that shit around, because it can clatter in a way that's excruciatingly painful. Yeah, I had a cat once that got hit by a car years ago. But this cat, Nelson, ginger cat, was an adorable pest. But there was something that would make him run away and not re-enter the room. And it was this tray that I've got that it's a ceramic base with a sort of wide... It's 12:42. I got a couple of minutes. Let me show you this thing. I like making tacos, and I like making tacos using this. I can put cheese in here and tomatoes in here. I don't need to use this one. I can have a pan with taco meat, and I can have taco sitting there and some lettuce there. And if I do this, that's the sound that would force Nelson to run away immediately, because ceramic on ceramic is frickin' loud. Here, I'll damp this by 20 dB pad. $20 down, and it's still brutal. Be careful around ceramics, folks, if you want to protect your hearing. And I do love these plates, but Kitty Cat has sensitive hearing up in the high frequencies there. And although it doesn't seem that horrifying to a human being, although you get the sense of like, wow, that was loud. But yeah, that's like really, 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 really loud. And, I could rattle that louder. I was talking that the thing that hurt the guy's hearing was dropping a ceramic thing onto a ceramic thing from a height of about 6 inches. I was just jostling that. So, be careful with your hearing. Be careful with your ears. So that said, this has been show and tell day, clearly. I have one blank page if anybody wants me to draw something. I'm not sure if there's time. Last questions? And have fun going and putting aluminum foil in your drums, if that's something that you choose to do. Joke was talking about living in an abandoned German factory pipe. That sounds interesting. And that's another thing also where brief sounds don't get perceived with headphones. The really loud stuff coming off of something like that ceramic is also very brief. So if you are in an acoustic environment that is live, that's what's going to make that more aggressive. If you are in an area that is more damped and less reverberant, it could fool you into thinking that it wasn't that overwhelming, but the spikes produced by ceramic objects and things like that, those are still really loud even if they don't sustain very long. Checking outside to see if anybody is trying to deliver me something. Alrighty. Reverb does indeed make some sounds visible. Alright, so on that note, this has been fun. There are some times that the Q&A session goes romping away in front of any questions that might happen. and just becomes a long, excruciating well, maybe not excruciating, a long diatribe. Basically, this happened because some of the other things going on in my life are an enormous drag, so this serves as some distraction. And I am honestly excited with the drum damping stuff that I've been doing. I'd really like to be able to get this stuff together where I'm doing stuff that's on par with some of the rock instrumentation and the music that I grew up being interested in. That is pretty much the goal. That's what I wanted to be able to do. So working on getting that stuff together. On that note, I think I'm about ready to see you guys later. As in next week. There's some stuff I'm often asked, like, what are you doing next? And here's an idea. I've made some notes on a kind of capacitor. Just so happens that there's a kind of ceramic capacitor, and I'm not sure how prevalent this is, but this can happen, so I wonder whether this happens with other ones as well, where the frequency of the capacitor is profoundly affected by how much DC pressure you're putting on it. That means that it is going to be frequency modulated. So, barium titanate-based ceramic capacitors, the more voltage you put on it for bias, the more that the frequency that they're operating at will drop. So you have a capacitor that is like X size and put 6 volts on it, and you lose 50% of the capacitance. The capacitance becomes smaller because it's effectively all getting filled up by the pressure of the voltage. That means, for assuming that it happens as fast as this, but I believe this is something that would function. You know how my old low pass and high pass had DC manipulations in them where the amplitude of the waveform would affect the frequency of it? So you could set it up to where stuff at the extremes would be either giving you a higher or a lower low pass amount. Well, what this means is this goes asymmetrical. If you have your positive here and your waveform goes up to where it's 5 volts, that is making the capacitor, whether it be a DC blocker or a shunt to ground, be much less. And if it goes to a profoundly negative voltage, that's going to make it be profoundly more. It's not centered around 0. Instead, it makes things be asymmetrical. And this is a Murata. The capacitor maker Murata had a tech note on this that I stumbled across reading a synthesizer subreddit. Somebody referred to this and I was like, oh, hello, that's interesting. And look, you lose 50% of the capacitance at 6 volts. That means that is a measurable and predictable sound coloration thing that, as far as I can tell, nobody is doing. So I can see whether I can get that together. I still have more dithers to put out as well, but this looks like it might be fun and interesting enough to throw together and see what I can make happen, seeing as the old low-pass and high-pass plugins that you can have, they're part of the regular downloads, let you do that, but not asymmetrically. Those plugins let you do that, but they mirror. What this suggests is that I can set it up to not mirror, and it will sound like certain kinds of capacitors in circuitry. Oh, one more thing. Ceramic capacitors are well established in guitar amplifiers. So this might be something to the direction of me being able to make the long-awaited good-sounding guitar amp modeling So yeah, we shall see. For now, I will bid you good night, and I gotta go and rest, because life has been challenging and difficult at the moment. But I'll get some... Oh, look. That's not still plugged in. I'm not sure what's even going on. That's the last image that I had on the NDI source. Boop, there we go. Talk to you guys later. And I'll see what I can bring you for Sunday. Bye-bye.